So today I'm going to be taking a look at a watch that I've wanted to take a look at for a pretty long time. This is a Citizen with this interesting mother of pearl dial. Ever since it came out, I thought it was interesting, I thought it was unique. It was a little bit pricey, and they never officially sold them in the US, so it was hard to get them. So I finally found one for a decent price. I think it's an interesting watch. I think it's a watch that people should know about and think people should definitely be considering because it's pretty cool. And yeah, let's get into the rest of the review. We have a diameter of about 40 millimeters, lug to lug of 47.9, basically 48, height of 11.8, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for the watch, we're gonna have the Citizen in-house caliber 950 movement beating away in here. We do have just a closed case back, unfortunately. It is a pretty nice movement. Apparently it debuted in this Citizen series. It is a little bit of an upgrade over some of their base models being a little bit thinner. It is beating at a 4 Hertz beat rate, which is a 28,800 vibration per hour movement. We get a 50-hour power reserve here, as well as a stated accuracy of between -5 to +10, which is fairly good for this price point. This model, at least in my short testing, has been running about +7 seconds a day, so although it's on the edge of that range, it still is running well. We do have 100 meters of state of water resistance, but this does not have a screw down crown. We have sapphire crystal on the front, which is domed on the inside and outside and features AR coating. They don't state whether it's on the inside or the outside, so I mean, it's somewhere. And interestingly enough, this movement has 16,000 amp meters of anti-magnetic resistance, which is over 3 times the kind of ISO rating. So it's kind of just nice to see that extra step towards that anti-magnetism. So starting with the dial here, and this is definitely the star of the show. Not to say there's not other aspects about it that are very nice, but it's really interesting what they did here and arguably executed pretty well. We do have a realistically multi-layered dial, where the kind of most interesting part is we have a base dial that is done in mother of pearl. Kind of hard to capture on camera the exact tones that are in it, but of course you get these whiter, brighter tones, you get these more purplish, bluish tones at more off angles, and I'll include some pictures that definitely show the different kind of colors that can be really just seen in this dial. It's very beautiful in person. If I kind of shade the light, you can see some of those purplish tones coming out a little bit more. And yeah, just very iridescent and kind of shimmery as you kind of expect a pearl and mother of pearl texture to be. You of course then have on top of that this metal grid structure, which just adds this little geometric flair to the watch itself. I do think it's an interesting touch and kind of adds a level of mystique to the mother of pearl. It doesn't, in a sense, show all the secrets at once, and it gives your eye something else to focus on rather than just the color shifting dial, and adds the color shift as more of a benefit rather than the entirety of the dial's purpose. And then we have the metal lattice structure attached to the outer minutes track, which is kind of hard to read. It doesn't really feel delineated into seconds very easily, or into minutes very easily rather. You can kind of tell at each minute marker there's a slightly darker and larger white pip, which we'll zoom in on when we do the macro footage, but on first impression it's not super easy to read. It takes your eye a second to focus really on what the actual time is. The dial aesthetically, it's very different from anything else you've seen from really any other brand. The metal applied indices are nice here. It's nice they didn't cheap out. They're multifaceted, they catch the light well. There's lume added, but not in a way that it really intrudes into the marker. It's a, again, full metal multifaceted marker, and then you have the lume on the very outboard of that marker, which I think is a very classy way to do it. Similarly for the handset, it's a skeletonized handset with lume on the very edges. So you have this beautiful architecture and feel and flair to the hands, but then you have lume, which quote unquote adds that nighttime functionality. The text done for the watch isn't too intense, and it is very readable, kind of on its own little island of black background on the 12 and the 6 o'clock here, just Citizen, Series 8, and automatic. I don't think they necessarily had to add the automatic there. Citizen and Series 8 I think would have done it, but again, I don't even think it's egregious as it is, so I can't complain too much. Taking a look in natural light, and it is a little bit more subtle on camera than it is in person. You can see that these tones of the mother of pearl come out more. You can really see it in that kind of left edge of the dial there. Those mother of pearl pearlescent tones really start to pop. These purplish and kind of brighter, whiter tones start to come out of the dial. It is just really lovely to see. It's nice to see that the dial goes from this very deep, dark color to this more bright and vibrant, fun color. And the whole metal applied indices are shining back at you, the handset's shining back at you, the surrounding metal is shining really nicely and catching the light beautifully. There's so many polished surfaces really contrasting with all the brush surfaces. Like, it is just genuinely a beautiful watch to view in shade. And kind of on the wrist, you can see how the light play happens, how beautifully the light, you know, gradually moves along all those links into the case, and then your eyes start to focus on the dial. It is just something that is something you're going to absolutely be looking at multiple times a day. In more direct sunlight, you can again see that mother of pearl pattern pop a little bit more. Again, it was very hard to capture it in video for some reason, but just trust me, it looks better in person. Yeah, it is just a nice looking watch. Thankfully, in direct sunlight, it doesn't look any duller or any less impressive than it does in the shade, and it doesn't look any cheaper as well, which is really nice and not always the case with watches. So zooming in on the dial here, and we can see how architectural everything really is. One, the text again is done well. It's printed onto the actual base plate itself, and I think it doesn't feel too bad. It doesn't interrupt the texture too much or the pattern of these little triangles into the dial. I would say I wish the text was a little bit thicker. I do think they went with a rather flat printing here, so that's something they can definitely improve on in the future. Once we're zoomed in here, we can see a lot more of those tones in the mother of pearl kind of coming out, those blues, those purples, those kind of just iridescent reds that pop out and kind of add some color depth to the rest of the watch. There is a lot of beautiful, beautiful color depth here, and that's going to kind of be, you know, luck of the draw, whether or not you get a good or bad slab of mother of pearl, but I do think they would hopefully at least pick decently interesting ones to put in the watch overall. One thing I will say is up close, some of the metal elements start looking a little bit rough. You can see the handset has this finish, which it's very weird. It's supposed to be almost like polished steel, but it's almost as if it's not finished properly or stamped out improperly, or they just went with this very rustic, almost aged finish, which is a little bit odd. I mean, obviously, depending on the light, it can catch the light and reflect very nicely back at you, but it's just an odd finish to have on the watch hands. It almost feels like they tried to do a brushing or tried to do some kind of plating, and it ended up a little bit weird. It ended up a little bit wrong. Very odd handset to go for, a very odd finishing technique. It is nice that they're bifaceted. It's nice that like one area lights up while other stays dark, but I don't really know exactly why they went with this finish, especially because it looks really just not good up close. And realistically, the markers have a similar kind of feel to them. It has a little bit of just dirtiness about the polished, shined elements. When you get the light to reflect on it, it pretty much goes away, but the polished elements don't look, I don't think, as clean as they could or as they should. And then focusing for a second on the seconds track, you can see again, you have the very thin lines, which just represent, you know, time in between the minutes, or realistically seconds, I guess. And then you have the actual larger little square, or rectangle more correctly, being the minutes between the minute markers. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the actual metal marker being the 5th minute. It's not very easy to delineate when you're looking at it from wrist view. It actually does take your eyes a second to adjust, and you will have to have good eyesight to even be able to notice it. So it's one of those things where I think it is aesthetically kind of cool, but functionally not good. You could also see for some reason we have 3 layers of seconds track, or 3 layers of minutes track, or however you want to identify this. You have the pure white on the outside, you have the grayer right there next to it, and on the very inside, on the actual metal base, we have a black, you know, portion of that seconds track. Why do we need 3 of them? I'm not quite sure. Does it kind of add to the aesthetic? Maybe a little bit, but it's just a little bit confusing. It's a little bit much, I think, overall. And you can see right there we have this speck of something stuck under the crystal. I mean, I don't really know what it is, but trust me, it's under the crystal. I checked a million times. It's unfortunate to see, and it kind of just tells the same story as the rest of the watch. A lot of these elements aren't QC to the best standard. It could be done a little bit better, or really a lot better. But I think the architecture and the aesthetic they did get down. It's just they need to get that extra 10% of finishing.
I'm not quite sure what the inspiration is supposed to be for the markers themselves, but I do like their almost tower shape. Of course, you have, the general base here of the Lume pip, then built up to the metal marker. You have this little extra pointer done in white that is on the metal base itself. Is this potentially just a way to line up all the markers to their, respective spots on the base? Maybe. But as it is, I do think it's a cool aesthetic. I do like how they all point in towards the center. Just gives you something interesting to look at. So overall, I think it's a decent dial. We have a color matched, relatively date wheel. It's not like a white thing staring back at you. It's obviously not a mother of pearl date wheel, but it kind of blends in with that black lattice structure. We have the very cool lattice structure. We have a pretty interesting and slightly useless seconds track. And relatively cool constructed markers, just not the best of finished. And the same thing goes with the hands. So there's a lot of good elements here. There's just a lot that needs to be tightened up. So looking at the case of this watch, and this may be my favorite part about it, it is just very different. It's angular, it's interesting, and I mean, thankfully it just doesn't look like everything else out there. We do have a lot of combination of brushed and polished surfaces. We do have just a general vertical brushing, very flat surface on the very top here. Then we have this cut down angularity turned down to the lug here, which is done in this very high polished surface. We have a little bit of brushing, tiny bit there, going into the actual bracelet case. It's done vertically, and it's interesting that they did that because they could have just left it polished, but I guess because it's another facet, they wanted to give it a different finish, and it does tie in well with the rest of the brush of the bracelet. We do have a fully polished, just slightly angled bezel that actually floats slightly above the case. You can see there's almost really space in there. I can get my thumb inside, so it's interesting. I've never seen really a spaced out crystal before, or spaced out bezel rather. You do have very beautiful gentle dome to that crystal as well, which follows nicely into the bezel, that very just gentle curve that follows along the entire side. Then on the sides of the case, full high polish, a little bit of a slant down for the lugs, not really a true curve or anything like that, but it does brace itself in an ergonomic way. You have these fully brushed crown guards, which is just very aggressive looking from the side because they're bolted in a sense. I do think it looks cool. It is a relatively small crown, but it's really easy to grip overall. Not too bad in the winding feel. It's not screechy or doesn't feel gritty or anything like that. Pulling out the crown to the first position, that's changing the date going away from you. Pretty nice feel to it. I could say it's a little bit soft for my taste. It could have a little bit better of a feeling. Very definitive click out to that last position. Moving of the hands themselves are super smooth and nice feeling. So I really can't complain there. It feels good in operation. Another aspect that you don't even notice is basically the case is the most bowed out here at the edges, and you can kind of tell there's a facet where the lugs start to curve inwards. It's just a very interesting, unique case shape that I haven't really seen before, and I like that they went so out of the box in a sense. It has just a beautiful, beautiful look to it. And it's so subtly done with its angularity that at some points you don't even notice, the general top view of the mid case actually is an octagon. You have these faceted sides on each angle, and it just gives this really unique look to the watch. You have the triangular portion of the lugs, you have this almost pyramidal feel to the crown guards, of course the angularity of the octagon. It is just a very interesting case, and everywhere you look there's something for your eye to be just drawn to, really. Just one last look at the lug architecture here. I just love what they did here. It is so sharp, and you can just see how defined the shape is that grabs the light. It is its own dedicated, plane, own dedicated surface, and the transition from the brushed part to the actual polished part of the lug itself is so defined. You can almost feel like there's a chamfer there at the top, but it's not. It's just the breakdown into the extra part of the lug. It is done well, it looks interesting, and yeah, it's a very cool case they went with. Looking at the bracelet, we have a very classic H-link style, very thin interim links, kind of thicker link here at the top of the bracelet where it connects to the end link itself. We do have a male end link style, so it does flare out a little bit past the bracelet itself. It doesn't wear too terribly on wrist though, so I'm not going to complain about that too much. The interesting part about the bracelet is it literally does not taper at all. It's 20 millimeters here at the top and it's 20 millimeters at the clasp. So it does give you a very kind of masculine definitive stance on wrist. It doesn't feel dainty. It almost really feels larger than 40 millimeters on the wrist, but it's relatively short lug to lug, so it just has a nice presence, but it doesn't feel overbearing in any way. Just like the finishing on the case itself, we do have a mix of brush and polish on the bracelet. You of course have the topped brush link. And during every mid link on the edges, you have this chamfer that is just beautifully polished. You have it on the very edges on the outside of the rounded parts of the links. You have it on every single kind of surface that can catch the light. It's done in a polish, which is just really interestingly done. It's a nice way to add a little bit of flair without making the bracelet feel too dressy or too fancy, and gives it a nice pop in a utilitarian sort of way. Going to the clasp, just kind of a classic fold over push button deployant. Feels very sturdy, feels very comfortable. It isn't really the fanciest part of the watch by any means. It doesn't look overly interesting, I guess you could say. It is just kind of the part that just functions, and it just is a clasp. It just does what it's supposed to do. Really no complaints. Citizen right there on the clasp. The buttons work really well and they have a nice feel to them. You have a little bit of almost ridging, I don't know quite what word to say, there on the push buttons. It genuinely does not add any extra grip. It's still very slick, so I don't really know what the purpose of that is. You can tell there is defined ridges, but it's not helping the clasp at all. It's more aesthetic than functional. And then to note, the bracelet is pin and collar, so that is slightly annoying. I prefer screw links, but you know, pin and collar, it is what it is. You can always size it, and thankfully it's not too hard to size. I will say it's nice that they included both full links and a smaller link to kind of get a good fit in there. So moving on to how this watch wears, it's going to be a very David and Goliath type situation here because I'm wearing this Must de Cartier tank. For reference, this guy is 23 millimeters. And here we have the Citizen sitting on my 6.5 inch wrist. And as you can see, it's definitely a larger presence. It is taking up a large portion of my wrist, but I don't think it's too big. It clearly still sits within the bounds of my wrist. Again, it's relatively short lug to lug. It just is one of those things where because you have it bowing out so much, it's not a traditional circle, it's more of a square / octagonal shape. So you have just more surface area in the case here. It's not rounded and soft along the side here. There's more metal than you would expect there to be. It's just one of those things where it's going to have a very visually large stance. I think this watch would almost be, in a sense, a perfect dress watch for people who are into sportier watches. This is a nice bridge between those two aesthetics. It's angular, but it's dressy. It has polished elements. It kind of catches the light nicely, but clearly we don't have a dive bezel. But also it's not dainty. It's not a true dress watch. It's not ultra thin, but it does wear thin enough to where it probably won't give you trouble with the dress cuff. This is a cool kind of hybrid styled watch. If I move the watch down a little bit, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist there. Again, it still doesn't look necessarily too big. It still doesn't overhang the wrist itself. Is it starting to feel a little dwarfing? Sure, but it's just personal preference whether or not that aesthetic appeals to you. I would say when I wear this kind of more full body view, it feels relatively fine, but it's up to you what you like aesthetically. Down the barrel, you can see it wears very close to the wrist itself. It doesn't really rise up high at all. That case back is pretty much non-existent, and it's a relatively ergonomic case, so again, it just wears pretty comfortably into the wrist. There aren't any overly sharp edges or any points of uncomfortable feeling on the watch itself. Even the crown guards have like a little bit of angled up about them. You can kind of see right there. So you're not really coming into contact with any really like 90-degree angles or anything like that. It's a very comfortable watch on wrist, and you know, I would say is machined pretty well and finished very well. Now I would say I don't really have necessarily the most perfect straps with me. I don't have all my normal straps, but I do like how this watch looks on straps because it very much defines that mid case, the angularity of it, that octagonal shape, that just really unique pseudo cushion type feel to it. And one thing I kind of just noticed is I feel like with cases like these that aren't traditionally circle and very soft and, you know, drop off very intensely over here at the lugs, it kind of is more useful to measure these on a diagonal. So if you measure it diagonally, we actually get closer to 43 millimeters. So realistically, I would say this is how that watch feels in terms of presence. It feels like an almost 42, 43 millimeter watch. And I think that's exemplified by if I bring in the moon swatch here, I think these have a very similar stance and presence. I measured it, these have the exact same 33 millimeter dial diameter. Again, this was about 43 millimeters in diagonal. If we take the moon swatch in diagonal, we get about 43 as well. So it's funny that, again, even though on first impression we measure the moon swatch and the diameter is, under 42 millimeters, it wears pretty much, to me, the exact same as this guy does. Like, for example, and now we have that on wrist. I think it's a very similar stance, if not the Citizen almost feeling a little bit larger. Here is a very cool rubber strap made by Peren. I don't know if you can order these separately, but I think it looks cool, so if you can, try to order it. I think this rectangular pattern on the bracelet kind of mirrors that H-Link style from the bracelet itself. I think it just ties in with the watch. The black plays off the black lattice structure there. And of course, it's just a very comfortable combo. Looks pretty cool in my opinion. It is one of those weird things where when you have it on wrist, you go, honestly, I probably wouldn't have mind if they went for a 22 millimeter lug there. And it is one of those things too where you can kind of see they could have absolutely hollowed away more at this section of the brushed lug there and gave it a little bit of a wider stance on wrist. I don't mind it as it is, but I do think a 22 would have just given it a slightly better stance than it has. And then next, very cool gray NATO. This is made by, they don't have any branding anywhere. Oh, there we go. Springmade. Very comfortable NATOs they make, and this I think looks cool on the watch. There we have it. I think it takes to a NATO pretty well. Again, because you have this super structured angular case, I think it just fits really well onto wrist. It's very defined. It gives you a lot of visual interest. So if you go with just relatively simple, clean, non-textured straps, it really lets this case shine and just look pretty awesome. And the nice part too is, again, because it doesn't wear too thickly on wrist, the NATO pretty much doesn't add that much height at all. It doesn't feel like it's rising up off the wrist too much. And again, feels very comfortable. If you use a double pass NATO, sure, maybe it will feel a little bit thicker on wrist, but either convert it to a single pass or use a double pass, and honestly, it's not going to feel that much thicker anyway. And lastly, the combo nearest and dearest to me. Classic white silicone strap, nice and bright, nice and fun, adds a real pop to the watch. Plays off some of the brighter white tones you get when the markers are starting to shine, plays off the whitish tones of the lume, the whitish tones of the text, and again, it's just comfortable. Looks pretty good on wrist. I would recommend for most people, because this feels almost slightly undersized in terms of lug at the 20 millimeters, to go with non-tapering straps, 20 to 20 like this, or like the NATO, or the first strap I showed. The black strap that I showed has a slight taper. I believe it's 20 to 18. So when you have a little bit of taper in the strap, it makes it feel a little bit more imbalanced, and this watch shouldn't feel any thinner on the legs than it is already. So this, I think, looks aesthetically nice, or at least nice enough. Getting the watch loomed up, it's not done terribly. You do have the lume on the periphery of each marker and on the very edge of the handsets. The unfortunate part is because they are in such a small lume space, you're not getting a lot of lume to those markers themselves. So it doesn't last for a long time. It's not overly bright, but while it does last, it's very legible. And, I think they could do a little bit better though. Reluming and comparing to the classic Timex Snoopy, of course, very similar to color temperatures. You can see that the Citizen has an almost BGW9 greenish blue sort of lume signature to it. I believe they probably just used some kind of weird in-house signature lume. Not quite sure. They don't really state it on the website, so if anyone knows, put it down below. But as it stands, starts out decently legible, but again, it's not a lot of lume and it doesn't last overly long. So pros and cons about this Citizen here, and I don't know how well it's appearing in the wrist view, but I think it's a very cool watch. It's interesting because aesthetically it doesn't really look like anything else. It has this pseudo octagonal shape. It has this beautiful mother of pearl dial, which gives you a lot of interesting light play. It was unfortunately a little bit hard to capture on camera. Hopefully I can include a photo or two that kind of captures it, but it is just different. It's unique, it's visually interesting, and I like that. Another
big pro for the watch is I think it wears incredibly well. Like I said, it almost feels more like a 42mm, but it's extremely short lug to lug. I think you can probably just tell in general like wrist view. It doesn't look overly huge on my wrist by any means, and it's a larger watch for sure. But again, larger watches that wear well, it doesn't matter. It feels comfortable on wrist. As long as it doesn't feel like it's overhanging, it looks relatively proportional, you can wear it if you want to. It's also a beautifully cut case. It has a lot of faceting to it. The bracelet, I think, is, you know, it's technically a modified H-link style, but it looks cool and blends with the aesthetic very well. It's relatively comfortable. There's no sharp edges or anything like that. It is just, I think, a really well done job, and it complements the dial really nicely. And my last pro, and to kind of just really harp on that point, I think the dial is pretty amazing. You have this, you know, metal lattice work structure, which adds some visual uniqueness to it. You have the beautiful mother of pearl underneath that really adds a nice, both somewhat textural element, because you can see it shift and morph underneath the lattice structure, but it adds this colorful element to the dial that wouldn't otherwise be there. You get these tones of purple and blue and like lightish greenish teals. It is just really, I mean, arguably, I think it's just beautiful. On to cons, and I think this is probably a nitpicky one, but I think for some people it may be too sporty. This is kind of like a weird section for the watch to fall into. It is undoubtedly kind of an everyday watch, but it has these elements of an aggressive case style. It has these elements of a dressy dial. It has these, you know, fine polished surfaces that are shining back at you, but it's a little bit large. It's not really in your face, but it does have this very defined presence, especially on a wrist. It's not an elegant 36mm watch, but it's also not a more subdued 39 or 40mm everyday feeling watch necessarily. So it falls into kind of this weird category, but I think it would pretty much be perfect for people who are into very sporty watches, but would like something dressier, especially without some kind of rotating bezel. This feels to me like the perfect dress watch for a sports watch person. My only other real con with the watch, and I guess really quickly I'll mention, I think the bracelet could be a little bit better. The clasp is a little bit whatever, it leaves a little bit to be desired. Wish there was some kind of micro adjust, maybe not on the fly, but at least just extra holes there, which would be nice. And my true real con is I do just think the QC could be better. The hands are really rough. I don't know why. I don't know what quite finish they were going for, because it looks, again, like polished hands, especially when you're looking at them, you know, just on the wrist, but they have almost subtle brush surface to them. Like they started to brush them and they're like, oh no, wait, these are supposed to be polished. It's very weird, it's very strange. I don't think it looks aesthetically nice up close, very almost utilitarian in its finishing. Maybe that's what they were going for, but I think if that's what they were going for, they should have just brushed them completely or done whatever kind of finish they were trying to go for better, because it doesn't look amazing. And similarly, some of the markers look a little bit rough, the polish section specifically. The brush looks nice, but the polish looks rough. It could just be a little bit better, it can be QC'd a little bit nicer, and I think especially since this watch typically goes for over $1,000, it should be a little bit better. Other than that, I honestly really like this watch, and I kind of thought I would because it was so unique when it came out online, but I think Citizen really hit the nail on the head here for the most part. It's a very beautifully constructed case. It's structurally unique. It has so many facets. It has this unique shape. It has an aggressive stance, but it feels a little bit elegant because all those polished surfaces. There's a lot to love here. And I think for most people, if you even think you'll like the watch, you're going to probably love it in person. There's not a lot that lets you down, which is nice. Like I mentioned, this is the perfect watch for people who like sports watches. If you want to try out something dressier, if you want to go a little bit out of your comfort zone, this is a larger wearing format for something that looks a little bit dressier, has a little bit more elegance to it, but still has this like weird sportiness to it to where you can still get away with it being worn in sporty situations. You can put it off the bracelet, you can put on a more rugged strap, you can put it on like a bund if you're really into that. I'm not, but you know, I can see it maybe. You can really have some fun with this piece. And I think it lends itself to that. And especially when you take off the bracelet like we saw earlier, the case shape becomes even more defined, even more unique, even more interesting. So again, there's a lot to love here, and it's hard not to love it. You know, what would I change if I was in charge of Citizen? I'd make it a little bit smaller. It's good as it is, but I think it would be almost weirdly elegant at 38mm. That being said, it still wears well. My smaller wrist can still take it overall, and that's like the most input I really have. Make it a little bit smaller, improve the bracelet a little bit, improve the QC, but you have a very nicely designed watch here. And I think you did something that's not like everything else, very unique, and offers pretty interesting value overall. Just in case I didn't mention it, I don't remember if I did. Typically the watch used goes for around $1,000, somewhere between $1,000 to $1,200 for the most part. Relative retail is, you know, hard to say because it was never sold in the US, but it goes for around $1,200 US in Japan specifically. I've seen them from like $1,200 to $1,400 US dollars. So, you know, it's not the cheapest watch on the planet. I think for what you're getting, this feels like a watch of that price point. It doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like a Citizen that was made for $300 and it's being sold for $1,000. It feels like a pretty good watch. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. More than happy to answer them. But that's all for me. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in another one.